From purchasing the state of Alaska, to developing interstate highways, to saving the world from World War III. This is every US president's biggest accomplishment. And while some presidents did nothing but put down fake rebellions, others pulled America from the edge of collapse. Like George Washington, who basically invented the role of president from scratch. 'Cause he built the first cabinet, used the veto power sparingly, and when angry farmers revolted over a whiskey tax, he personally rode out on horseback to shut it down. But his biggest move was walking away. 'Cause after 2 terms, he left office. In a world where kings ruled until they dropped dead, Washington created America's tradition of a peaceful transfer of power. Unfortunately, John Adams didn't quite have the aura of Washington. But give the guy some credit. He kept America out of a full-blown war with France. 'Cause after the XYZ affair, everyone wanted to fight. France wanted to shake down America for cash, and Congress wanted to punch him back. But John Adams chose peace and signed a treaty instead, saving the young republic from a war it probably wouldn't have survived. And thank the Lord he did, because it allowed this next president to score the greatest real estate deal of all time, the Louisiana Purchase. 'Cause Thomas Jefferson's biggest accomplishment was doubling the size of the country overnight. After Napoleon Bonaparte's dream of building a French empire in the Americas collapsed, he suddenly put the Louisiana Territory up for sale. And Jefferson jumped at the opportunity, snagging everything from the Mississippi River to the Rockies for just $15 million. Holy crap! But speaking of crap, James Madison was sure in a lot of it. 'Cause during the War of 1812, Britain invaded, torched the US Capitol, and showed just how unprepared America's military really was. And strategically, the war was a mess, but the US held its own and suffered 0 territorial losses. Let's call it a moral victory. But the cherry on top came when Andrew Jackson's ragtag army destroyed the British in New Orleans, 'cause it gave Americans a new sense of swagger and national unity. Up top. But in order to prevent war from happening again, James Monroe established the Monroe Doctrine, which was basically America's no trespassing sign, declaring the Western Hemisphere off limits to Europe. Stay back! And the doctrine was so influential, it became the cornerstone of US foreign policy for the next century. So with foreign powers at bay, this next president could actually focus inward. 'Cause John Quincy Adams envisioned a beautiful United States stitched together with roads, canals, and engineering marvels. And in 1825, he built the Erie Canal, linking the Great Lakes to the Atlantic and connecting Western farms and Eastern markets. To Adams, this was the glue that bound the nation together. But while some presidents wanted to hold things together, others wanted to smash them apart. Like Andrew Jackson, who despised the Second Bank of the United States, viewing it as elitist, corrupt, and only benefiting the wealthy. So Jackson went on the offensive, vetoing its recharter, yanking federal deposits, and basically starving it to death. And in 1835, his gamble paid off. Literally. 'Cause he paid off the entire national debt. The only time in US history that's ever happened. Maybe this guy's not so bad after all. Until the whole economy collapsed. 'Cause Jackson's war on the bank left Martin Van Buren with the panic of 1837, where banks failed, businesses folded, and unemployment skyrocketed. But the real danger was back when the government's money sat in private banks. So if the banks collapsed, like many did, the nation's tax dollars were this close to going poof. So as a result, Van Buren established an independent treasury, which stored government money in federal vaults instead. Phew, close call. I almost lost my retirement. Hey, get back here. But this next president barely had time to hang up his coat, 'cause William Henry Harrison died just 31 days into office. And while he's remembered for his marathon speech in the rain, it was actually his campaign that was legendary. The famous log cabin and hard cider campaign, where they took a man born into wealth and rebranded him as a rugged front porch farmer who drank hard cider with the common man. Throw in some rallies, songs, and a snappy slogan, and Harrison basically invented the modern populist campaign. But after he died, John Tyler took the reins and made a bold move that would shape America forever, annexing Texas. 'Cause in 1845, Tyler brought this massive new state into the Union. And although it poured fuel on the slavery debate and provoked Mexico, many Americans saw this as a triumph of manifest destiny. Howdy, partner. But speaking of expansion, Texas was just the appetizer. 'Cause James Polk came in serving the main course, the Mexican-American War, which ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the U.S. walking away with California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and chunks of Colorado and Wyoming. That's nearly half of Mexico's land. And while that was going down, Polk also cut a deal with Britain to settle the Oregon border, snagging the entire Pacific Northwest without even firing a shot. This guy was on a roll. There's no question about it, 'cause Polk crammed one of the most productive presidencies into just 4 years. But he couldn't have pulled off victory without Zachary Taylor, a hero of the Mexican War and our next president, who, despite being a slave owner himself, opposed expanding slavery to California, urging them to draft a free state constitution and apply for statehood fast. But this infuriated the South, who threatened to secede. So what did Taylor do? He told them he'd personally lead an army and hang anyone who rebelled. Let's just say you don't want to mess with this guy. Until he died, and Millard Fillmore became president, who passed the Compromise of 1850, which welcomed California as a free state and banned the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Woohoo! Sounds like progress, right? Well, the deal also included the Fugitive Slave Act, which forced Northerners to return escaped slaves or face prison time. So, although many praised Fillmore for saving the Union, it turned out to be a temporary truce. But this freed up our next president, Franklin Pierce, to keep the expansion train rolling with the Gadsden Purchase, a $10 million deal with Mexico for the southern parts of Arizona and New Mexico, finalizing America's continental borders with no war, no chaos, and just a simple handshake. Woohoo! Peace at last. Wait, what's happening? In Utah, rumors spread that Brigham Young and the Mormons were in open revolt against federal authority. So, President James Buchanan sent 2,500 U.S. troops to march on Utah. But in reality, there actually wasn't much of a rebellion at all, just a little tension. But when the Mormons saw an army coming over the horizon, they panicked and quickly assembled a militia. The conflict could have popped off into a bloody battle at any moment. But Buchanan stepped in, chose peace, and offered a full pardon to Utah residents in exchange for accepting U.S. law. Did you just pardon them for a rebellion that never existed? No, never mind. But instead of dealing with fake rebellions, Abraham Lincoln faced the real thing, the Civil War. With 7 states seceded and more threatening to follow, Honest Abe's entire presidency came down to one mission: win the war and keep the Union alive. And early on, it was bleak. 'Cause the Union got slapped around and D.C. was nearly surrounded. But Lincoln refused to quit and found generals who could actually win. Hello, Ulysses S. Grant. And after 4 brutal years and hundreds of thousands of deaths, Lincoln's leadership carried the Union to victory, keeping the United States united. Let's not do that again. But after Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson was thrust into the presidency. And although he's not remembered as the best president, he did get one major win: Alaska. 'Cause he allowed Secretary of State William Seward to negotiate a deal with the Russian Empire, $7.2 million for a frozen frontier twice the size of Texas. And at the time, critics nicknamed it Seward's Folly, mocking him for blowing $7 million on a big empty icebox. It's freezing out here, sir. But it turns out, joke's on them. 'Cause not only did Alaska have gold, oil, and half the world's salmon, it booted Russia from North America for good. Not so bad for a so-called wasteland, huh? But speaking of winners, Ulysses S. Grant was the Union general who crushed the Confederacy. And when he became president, he kept on waging war. But this time, it was against the Klan. 'Cause he signed the Enforcement Acts, sent in federal troops, and clobbered the KKK. Pair that with the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed voting rights regardless of race, and Grant accomplished more for Black Americans than anyone at the time. But the troops couldn't stay in the South forever, 'cause Rutherford B. Hayes slid into office through the Compromise of 1877, a smoky backroom deal that said, "We'll give you the presidency, but you gotta remove federal troops." He took the deal. And although this averted a controversial election crisis, it abandoned Black Americans to Jim Crow. Not exactly the best presidential accomplishment on our list. But at least James Garfield made waves by taking on the spoils system, the swampy tradition of handing out government jobs to party hacks. 'Cause Garfield was a man of merit, a genius who envisioned a government run by people who actually earned their positions. Until assassination cut his crusade short, dying just 4 months into office. But when Chester A. Arthur became president, he was the last guy anyone expected to clean house, 'cause he built his whole career off the spoils system, handing out government jobs like party favors. But instead, plot twist, Arthur flipped the script and signed the Pendleton Civil Service Act, a landmark reform that basically said, hey, maybe government jobs should go to people who actually know what they're doing. And believe it or not, the swamp draining continued with this next president. 'Cause Grover Cleveland was basically a human veto stamp, vetoing dozens of pork barrel projects, shady pension grabs, and special interest bills. If Congress tried sneaking junk onto his desk, Cleveland swatted it like a fly. And the anti-corruption train kept rolling with Benjamin Harrison, who passed the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, the first federal law to ban monopolies, a direct shot at robber barons who'd been running the economy like their own private fiefdoms. And although it didn't bust the giants overnight, it did draw a line in the sand. From here on out, monopolies will be challenged in court. But until then, William McKinley took office. And even though he didn't go looking for a fight, the USS Maine mysteriously exploded in Havana Harbor. So McKinley declared war with Spain in the Spanish-American War and quickly steamrolled them in 100 days. Largely thanks to Roosevelt's Rough Riders, who charged up San Juan Hill and forced the Spanish to retreat, and Admiral Dewey for sinking Spain's fleet in Manila Bay. The perfect 1-2 punch. 'Cause as a result, McKinley walked away acquiring Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, elevating the US to big league world empire status, whether he planned to or not. But thanks to his Rough Rider reputation, Teddy Roosevelt exploded into the White House like a shot of espresso, and quickly earned the title of Trust Buster, breaking up massive monopolies like Standard Oil, the American Tobacco Company, and J.P. Morgan's railroad monopoly. But his crowning achievement came with the Square Deal, which had 3 promises: control corporations, protect consumers, and conserve natural resources. And thanks to Teddy, life for the average American got pretty dang good. So William Howard Taft came in and delivered more of the same. A lot more. 'Cause Taft trust busted twice as much as Roosevelt, filing 99 antitrust suits. He even went after U.S. Steel, which ironically ticked off Roosevelt, who thought Taft was overdoing it. But the message was crystal clear. No company was too big, too rich, or too cozy to escape a courtroom smackdown. But instead of getting rich, it wasn't always easy for the little guy. 'Cause America's banking system was the Wild West, with financial panics frequently wiping out savings overnight. So Woodrow Wilson created the Federal Reserve System in 1913, a central bank to stabilize currency, control credit, and act as a lender of last resort. And hey, you might have heard of the Fed, 'cause it's still the backbone of American finance to this day, for better or worse. But after Wilson came Warren G. Harding, who hosted the Washington Naval Conference, the first international disarmament summit, where after World War I, major powers like the US, Britain, France, Japan, and Italy sat down and agreed to stop building an infinite amount of battleships. And thanks to Harding, we basically had world peace for a decade, allowing the 1920s to kick in under Calvin Coolidge, a silent man who believed that less government meant more prosperity, 'cause he slashed taxes, balanced budgets, and even paid down the national debt. Cal liked to say, collecting more taxes than is absolutely necessary is legalized robbery. And I think he was right, 'cause the result was the Roaring '20s, A decade of unprecedented prosperity with wages up, unemployment at 3%, and factories churning out cars. Ouch! Looks like we just hit the Hoover Dam, Herbert Hoover's big achievement. 'Cause Hoover developed one of the greatest infrastructure projects of the 20th century. A colossal dam that harnesses the Colorado River, prevents floods, and generates cheap power for the entire Southwest. Cities like LA and Las Vegas, yeah, they wouldn't exist without this bad boy. But more importantly, the Hoover Dam stands as a symbol of American ingenuity, proof that the US could build big, bold, world-changing things. Look, honey, they somehow built this in the 1930s. But speaking of the 30s, the Great Depression had the entire nation on life support. So Franklin Roosevelt shocked it back to life with the New Deal, a sweeping series of programs, agencies, and reforms that sought to revive America's heartbeat. Clear? 'Cause FDR launched Social Security, the SEC, FDIC insurance, and the CCC and WPA to put millions of Americans to work on building roads, schools, and parks. It was bold, controversial, and it was massive. But more than just relief, the New Deal permanently redefined the role of the federal government. Sir, this guy wants another handout. But when Harry Truman took office, World War II was winding down to a close. Or so we thought. 'Cause although Germany surrendered within weeks, Japan kept fighting. And Truman faced an impossible decision: keep slugging it out in the Pacific or unleash a new weapon that could bring the world to its knees. So in 1945, Truman dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, delivering a final blow to end World War II. But while Harry Truman was blowing up roads, this next president was building them. 'Cause Dwight Eisenhower launched the interstate highway system, the biggest public works project in American history. Inspired by the German autobahns he saw in World War II, Ike pushed through the Federal Aid Highway Act, paving 41,000 miles of road that slashed travel times, supercharged coast-to-coast trade, and fueled the rise of the suburbs. It's great for getting me to work, but seriously, is the whole country turning into one giant highway, or is it just me? But this next president didn't have time for pouring concrete, because John F. Kennedy was staring down the Cuban Missile Crisis, where U.S. spy planes spotted Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Red alert! JFK had no good options. Invade and the missiles might launch, bomb them, and risk all-out nuclear war with the Soviets. One wrong move, and the world could be reduced to ashes. So Kennedy chose a third path. He imposed a naval blockade around Cuba while negotiating with the Soviets. And for 13 days, the planet held its breath. Until suddenly, a deal was made. The Soviets agreed to remove their missiles, and the US promised to never invade Cuba, along with secretly removing missiles from Turkey. It was the closest humanity had ever come to nuclear Armageddon, and JFK pulled us back from the brink. Man, this guy did not deserve to be assassinated. But while JFK saved the world, this next president set out to repair America, because Lyndon Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a sweeping law that bans segregation in schools, workplaces, and public spaces. And for the first time, discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin was illegal. Now, while it didn't heal racism overnight, it was a monumental turning point in American history. But speaking of turning points, Richard Nixon pulled off one of the boldest diplomatic moves of the 20th century. He opened the door to China. For decades, the US refused to even recognize Mao's communist government. But Nixon, a savvy Cold War strategist, saw an opening. If America built ties with China, it could squeeze the Soviet Union. So he personally flew to China, shook hands with Mao, and drove a wedge between Beijing and Moscow, turning an enemy into a partner while shifting the Cold War balance in America's favor. Talk about playing 4D chess. It's too bad he got caught up in Watergate, resigned, and left us with Gerald Ford, whose big achievement was basically doing the opposite of Nixon. 'Cause after Nixon left office, government distrust was at an all-time high. The people wanted transparency. So Ford engaged with the public, gave press conferences, and even volunteered to testify before Congress. But his big move came when he pardoned Richard Nixon. 'Cause although it cost him politically, Ford believed the nation couldn't heal while Nixon was still on trial. You better go thank him right now. But speaking of tough times, Jimmy Carter's presidency had plenty of them. But one major positive was the Camp David Accords, where Carter personally mediated intense negotiations between Egypt's president and Israel's prime minister, two leaders who hated each other. But after 13 tense days, Egypt became the first Arab nation to recognize Israel. And Israel agreed to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula, a big boy step toward peace in the Mideast. And Carter received a Nobel Peace Prize 20 years later for his accomplishment. But while Carter brokered peace deals, the U.S. economy was a full-on dumpster fire. High inflation, high unemployment, and lousy growth. So Ronald Reagan stepped up and delivered Reaganomics, a mix of giant tax cuts, deregulation, and a tighter monetary policy. And as a result, Reagan broke the back of stagflation and unleashed an economic boom for years to come. But it didn't stop in the 80s. Reaganomics still echoes through U.S. policy to this very day. Kinda like the Gulf War, one of the only Middle Eastern wars where we got in, won, and got out. 'Cause after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, George H.W. Bush teamed up with over 30 other nations and launched Operation Desert Storm. And in just 6 weeks, Kuwait was liberated. The air and ground campaign was fast, decisive, and came with minimal U.S. casualties. But most importantly, once the mission was complete, Bush chose to leave instead of occupying Iraq. Good decision, big guy. Maybe tell your son next time. 'Cause this set up the U.S. for another economic bull run, where Bill Clinton oversaw rapid growth, low unemployment, and the rise of the tech boom, creating 22 million new jobs. And by the end of Clinton's second term, the federal budget wasn't just balanced. It ran the first surplus in decades. Whew, man, the things I'd do to go back to the 90s. But everything changed after 9/11, the worst terrorist attack on American soil. 'Cause George W. Bush stood at ground zero with a bullhorn and a promise. The people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon. And he delivered. 'Cause within weeks, U.S. forces crushed the Taliban in Afghanistan and dismantled the regime that sheltered Al-Qaeda. It was fast, decisive, and the sledgehammer America demanded. And if Bush stopped there, just like his pops, his legacy might have been one of swift, righteous victory. But of course, history, or maybe the military-industrial complex, had other plans. But speaking of complicated legacies, Barack Obama's defining achievement was the Affordable Care Act, better known as Obamacare, a law that expanded Medicaid, allowed young adults to stay on their parents' plans until age 26, and banned insurers from preventing coverage to those with pre-existing conditions. Critics called it government overreach and blamed it for rising costs. But love it or hate it, Obamacare permanently reshaped the way Americans receive healthcare. But then came Donald Trump, whose signature win was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, slashing the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. And this sparked a massive economic surge, because unemployment hit a 50-year low, wages rose, and the stock market broke record after record. I even bought myself a new car. Until COVID hit and it all came crashing down. You can take the keys back, sir. So Joe Biden came in and did his best to clean up the COVID mess, passing the American Rescue Plan, a $1.9 trillion package that sent out stimulus checks, boosted unemployment benefits, and poured resources into vaccine distribution. And by the end of 2021, society was finally crawling out of the pandemic slump. Sir, I think we should give out more stimmy checks.
Huh?
Okay, just kidding. But if you think this is the first time a president gave something away for free, you got another thing coming. Because this is every presidential first in U.S. history. From the first presidential assassination, to the first televised debate, to the first commander-in-chief dropping a nuclear bomb. These firsts are so crazy, I'm gonna need you to be the first one to click on this next video. And keep the flappy content rolling, because this one is a wrap.